Please welcome to the stage digital transformation writer with Adweek, Molly St. Louis.
Morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CryptoConf. Bitcoin, blockchain, digital cash, and the volatile cryptocurrency markets have dominated headlines this year. But where will blockchain technology bring us next? Well, we've got a great mix of speakers for you today, from crypto investing heavyweights to those who live and breathe the complex ecosystem and those driving innovation on the blockchain. Before we begin, we have a great feature built into our app if you want to take a look. It's called Slido, and it's for anybody that wants to ask a question during any of our talks today. You can go to it. It's in the More section of your app, and you can follow the instructions from there and ask our moderators any questions. So, the main event. Just as speed and access to information on the web have expanded knowledge, so too will an internet of value bring down the cost of financial services, speed up money transfers, and deliver access to the furthest reaches of the world. To discover the potential of the internet of value, please welcome to the stage CNN's Ivana Kodosova in conversation with Ripple's Chief Cryptography Officer, David Schwartz.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's great to have you here, David. We will be using Slido for this session, so hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes at the end. If you have any questions for David, please, here is how to log them in, and hopefully we'll get to them. Time is short. David, let's start with the question that everyone wants to hear about. Tell us about Internet of Value. What's your vision for this? How does it work?
Well, I think a lot of people found Bitcoin interesting because they were frustrated with the siloing of money and liquidity. This idea that there are all these different payment systems that don't talk to each other. You can look at a website from a company in South Africa, let's say, but it's very difficult to send money to them, specifically small payments. And I think a lot of people who were inspired by Bitcoin in the early days kind of had this idea that, well, everybody would use Bitcoin and this problem would go away. Fast forward a couple of years and we built something like 1,500 plus brand new silos for value to be trapped into. So we solved a different problem than the problem we thought we were solving, and the problem that a lot of us were concerned about, this idea that people can't pay each other easily. We created a newer version of it with more silos. So the Internet of Value vision is to break down that siloing, to do for money what the Internet did for information, to make it so that money can flow as easily as information does. I guess like the simplest vision would be the idea that you could pay somebody as easily as an email, that there could be some universal payment address, and it wouldn't matter if they were using PayPal or a bank or Bitcoin or some mobile payment system in Africa. It would make no difference. The money would just find a path and flow. And I guess if you want to go into sort of like the longer term vision, just like the internet at first just enabled us to communicate with each other, but over time, it's how we turn our light switches on, it's how my car tells me when it's done charging. I mean, it's just changed everything behind the scenes. I think over the next 10 years or so, we'll start to see these Internet of Value payments behind the scenes changing the world in ways that are not so obvious, but make life better for people.
Can you give us any examples of these microtransactions that could make people's life easier and would bring them together and make the payment processes smoother? And
it's hard to. It's like if we were talking about the internet in the mid-90s or something and trying to think about like what it would do, and all of the things that I would say that are part of our everyday lives today would seem so far-fetched to you. Like if I said that teenagers around the world will, talk about when they're going to get groceries or what new dress they bought. It doesn't sound like it's world-changing, but that improved connectivity overall is world-changing. It brings everybody closer together. And I think we'll start to see similar things. I can think of bad examples. Like one of them that just is incredibly practical is this idea that my phone can buy Wi-Fi access wherever I go. I mean, that just makes perfect sense. But is that going to change the world? No. I think we've started to see things like ships turning around in the middle of the ocean because the price of their goods have changed or the demand has changed. So I think we'll see more of an on-demand economy. The long-term vision is that everything can pay everything else. Machines can pay each other. If you look at how machines being able to exchange information with other machines changed our world, I think machines being able to pay other machines cheaply and quickly will change the world too. But it's very difficult to predict how that will happen. Like, I can construct an example like you walk past a store, and maybe that store pays you for information on what products you're interested in. And that allows the store to show you more relevant advertising, and it also means that you're the one who's in control of what information you give to the store. I would prefer not to see dating ads because I'm married. I would prefer not to see women's clothing ads because I don't know how to buy women's clothing. But there are ads that I would like to see. If, there's a new processor out, I might like to know about it, and those are probably terrible examples. Again, if you ask people the same question about the internet, they would not be able to come up with the kinds of examples that would be right. But I think the potential is enormous.
Do you see people paying with their information, with their data more?
I've seen a lot of business models based around that. I think it's possible to happen. I think if you look at the way privacy has evolved, people should value their privacy, but they seem to value convenience a lot more. It used to be that we didn't talk about religion, we didn't talk about politics, we didn't talk about sex, we didn't talk about money. Well, all of those taboos have collapsed except for one, and that's money. So if I was a betting man, I would bet that people would be willing to be more open with their finances and other information about them if that makes the world more convenient for them. But I do like strategies and business models that leave the consumer in control of what information they reveal. So if I don't want to reveal that information to that store, then I'm going to see an ad that's not relevant to me, but I don't have to tell them, what my concerns are. I would definitely like to see people be able to keep more control over their information. But honestly, I wouldn't bet against business models that assume that they won't care. Like, unfortunately, the trend has been that people don't value privacy no matter to what extent we think they should. I think that's a little unfortunate, but...
I love the idea of being able to make payments very quickly for every little thing that you see and you want. How do we build that thing? How do we build the internet of value? We already have apps that would allow me and you to go out for a meal and split the bill really easily. We have other apps, but there gets a point where having an app for every single payment is just too much. So do we need the Googles to step in and build something overarching, or should we let it grow organically?
I think the answer is in... I think the answer is in the term Internet of Value. I take a lot of inspiration from what the Internet did. So in the pre-Internet days, there were a lot of distinct information networks. Every company had their own information network. Even companies that sold access to information networks were selling access to their own private information networks, and then they had like bespoke connections. So if you had America Online, there was a way you could email someone at CompuServe, but it was like very finicky. You had to use the gateway. That's kind of where we are with money, and I think that we can take almost the exact same path. In fact, the more that we looked at this over the last 3 or 4 years, the more we realized that payments are actually very similar to information. Like, packets of money can go through routers between payment systems, just as packets of information can go through routers between information networks. What I would argue we need is a light interoperability protocol. My colleagues at Ripple have developed Interledger, and together with an open source community and with the W3C and several other participants. And what that is it's a very light, very neutral protocol that can coordinate the movement of value across ledgers that track it. And it's not tied to any particular ledger technology. It can connect to digital assets like XRP and Bitcoin and others, and it can also connect to traditional ledger systems like PayPal or mobile money systems or even banks. So I would argue that we pretty much should repeat exactly what we did for information with money, and I think people will be surprised at how parallel the two systems are.
There is one big difference, though, and that is, as you said, people should care more about privacy and information. But they already do care a lot more about money. Anything that involves money, people would be a lot more cautious about security, worried about hacking and all that. So do we need a regulator? Do we need a stricter set of rules than we have for information flow over internet, for Internet of Value?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there with the security side and the regulatory side. I think one of the benefits that we'll have is that all of these protocols are being designed today when we know a lot more about computer security than we did in the 60s when the previous generation of financial systems were built. Public key encryption, the way that you access a website securely, wasn't publicly known if it existed in the 60s, and so these systems are not based on any of those modern technologies. So we have a tremendous opportunity to improve security and privacy as well. Public key encryption can be used for both. If we want to, and we could also build dystopian systems that, don't provide any privacy for anybody. And if users are willing to sacrifice privacy, businesses are willing to let them. I think we've started to see government pushback on that, particularly from the EU recently. And I think we're going to need to strike a balance. I think you could imagine a dystopian world where nobody has any financial privacy at all, and you could imagine a world, where we don't have those problems. And I think regulators definitely do play a role, and I think companies play a role as well. And I hope we don't have as rocky a road as we had with information, but I can't promise. The company that I work for, Ripple, does an enormous amount of regulatory education and engagement, precisely because we don't want regulators to just, we don't want their first encounter with these technologies to be when something goes wrong. We want them to understand what the potential is and the way that we can make the world a better place.
So you want to involve them at the very beginning of the process. What about the big banks, the big players in the ecosystem? Do you want them to be on board as well, just in case, this thing takes off, and you don't want them to come in late and try to disrupt it and form it?
I think banks understand that banks are getting squeezed from both ends. So they're sending billions of dollars to their correspondents, and they're seeing tremendous competition from non-banks that are offering faster payments to their customers. So they understand that they're going to have to improve the services that they provide, or they're going to increasingly become less relevant, particularly in international payments. With domestic payments, it's pretty good in most countries. International payments, the delays and the costs are more of a problem.
Give me your example with the Mexican peso and dollar. I really enjoyed it, I think, the audience as well. So how do you speed up the process of the payment using your technology?
So xRapid is Ripple's first product that actually settles an international payment using a digital asset as the intermediary. And the best example is probably from the United States to the Mexican peso. That's just like the perfect corridor. And what happens is, in a space of about 2 minutes, US dollars are sold for XRP at a US exchange, or at an exchange that handles US dollars. The XRP is sent on the ledger to an exchange that supports Mexican pesos. And then once the XRP is received by the Mexican exchange, you can purchase Mexican pesos and then command the exchange to make a payment through the Mexican domestic payment system. So the net effect is that in a span of about 2 minutes, you've accomplished essentially a remittance payment from a US domestic rail to a Mexican domestic rail. Qualix is completed a production pilot testing this technology. They saw savings of between 40 and 60% and speeds of 2 minutes instead of 2 or 3 days. And I think from a strategy of versus going to a conservative bank and telling them that you're going to have to do all these things differently. Maybe you don't do international payments yourself, but we want you to do international payments yourself. And we want you to hold this digital asset, and we want you to make liquidity. And it's just too much for them to do for an uncertain payoff. But if you go to a remittance company that controls both ends of the transaction already, they're already regulated to do remittances, and you tell them, just source the liquidity differently. Change this one piece and it's cheaper and faster. That's a much easier sell. So the way out of these kind of chicken and egg problems of nobody wants to build a system because nobody wants to use it, nobody can use it because it doesn't exist, is to find these sort of points where you can get some leverage, where someone can get an immediate benefit, and then deploy those.
Where does the savings come from? So you said 40% savings. Is it because the volatility is smaller because it takes shorter time to settle that transaction, or is it because there is no fees to banks? Where is it coming from?
It's a combination of several factors. One of them, surprisingly, is that the volatility is actually less. So the volatility of XRP, even though it's more volatile than any fiat asset, or almost any fiat asset. Even though the XRP is volatile, it's not that volatile in 2 minutes compared to the Mexican peso for 2 or 3 days. So the volatility is actually better, which is pretty stunning. But the savings also come from avoiding having to deal with an enormous number of counterparties. In this case, the XRP transfer is effectively free. It's a tiny fraction of a penny. So the hard part is getting from like a US-based funding thing to a Mexican-based like value system. That's the hard part. Like all the domestic stuff is cheap and easy. So the actual hard part is effectively a tiny fraction of a penny and takes a few seconds. So that's really where the source of both the time savings and the cost savings.
We have a question from the audience here. So how does Ripple fit into the Internet of Value?
Oh, I love that question. I wonder if like one of my colleagues actually put it up there. It's such a great question. If not, thank you to whoever. So that's actually a good. It might seem counterintuitive. Like, why is Ripple, who's kind of been working on this cryptocurrency XRP that we're using, for all of our products and is kind of where our bets are placed, like why would we want this Internet of Value that puts everything on a level playing field? And there's a couple reasons. So one of them is we think we can win on a level playing field. XRP is faster and cheaper and perfectly positioned for the use case. And I think the other reason is almost more important, that this is not a winner take all. I don't think anybody thinks there's going to be one asset that's going to take over the world. There's going to be lots and lots of assets, and all of those assets are more valuable if they can interoperate. Just like the internet is not biased in favor of Twitter or biased in favor of Facebook. And Facebook and Twitter wouldn't want it to be, because then the market that they could sell into of internet users would be smaller. So we kind of all benefit from an open, powerful, useful system that creates this enormous market of people with access to that system. And then that's our target market for products and services, and not just for us, but for everyone.
You could, though, argue that Facebook and Twitter, they can work together because they're both getting different parts of different pies, whereas all these cryptocurrency companies and all these assets would be competing for the same customer, for the same pot of money. So how do we prevent the competition from disrupting the whole thing and everyone just trying to...
I don't think they are necessarily. Like, to some extent, wireless internet access competes with Ethernet or competes with fiber optic access, but they also target different customers with different use cases. The analogy that I would use would be like the Model T. The Model T was like the first car, and everybody's like, well, that's a car. But, we got trucks, and we got sports cars, and we got tankers, and we got all of these specialized vehicles aimed at specific use cases. I think what we're starting to see now is stratification around use case. Ethereum's use case tends to be smart contracts and ICOs. Bitcoin has aimed at store value. XRP, where Ripple's positioning as a sort of intermediary settlement asset. So I think if all of these assets can go after their own use cases and they can interoperate seamlessly when you need to pay across them, I think that's the best way to accomplish what we want to accomplish.
We have another question from the audience. What's your view on Ripple volatility, especially the last year's surge and collapse of the token? So here's your chance to explain the difference between Ripple and...
I think collapse is a bit of a maybe. Yeah, so the whole cryptocurrency market, as you know, has dropped significantly. I think that kind of shows that the marketplace doesn't yet distinguish between the use cases that cryptocurrencies are aimed at. I think for people who are building technology, it's kind of a distraction. Like, what we care about is adoption, newer technologies. Are we solving real problems for real people? I do understand how the price can be a distraction, and I have to admit that it has occasionally been distracting for me. But I really think people should focus on the fundamentals and look at, like, what is the new technology? Does this solve real problems? And I think the market will eventually reflect the underlying utility. But,
I mean, the bombastic growth in prices have definitely put cryptocurrencies back on the agenda, and it sort of became something everybody was talking about. My taxi driver yesterday was asking me whether he should buy Bitcoin. I will not tell you what I told him. But how do we move from that focus on the price and on how to make money really quickly buying Bitcoin and turning it around, speculating on the price, to actually using blockchain technology to what the technology guys like you would like it to be, so exchange of value? Because no one, or not very many people, are using cryptocurrencies as exchange of value instruments right now. So.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why the marketplaces are so volatile and to some extent illiquid is the fact that all we have are speculators and market makers. The real utility hasn't come up yet. I think probably we're going to continue to see this same kind of bizarre behavior in the market that doesn't seem to relate to the underlying value or value propositions of these tokens until we do see the real use. And I think XRapid is a good example. Like people actually buying XRP not because they think it's going to go up in price, but because they want to transfer it to another country. And people selling it not because they think the price is going to go down, but because they need to make a payment in Mexico. I think bringing those real users into the ecosystem will help to settle out that volatility. But again, I don't have a crystal ball, so, you know, and the market has consistently surprised me, so my predictions haven't been more correct than anyone else's, so I guess we'll just have to see.
So let's close on that, on the predictions. My last question, 20 years from now, Internet of Value, what's your wildest dream on where we're going to be in 20 years' time?
I think payments should be so seamless, so fast, and so cheap that we don't even think about them. They're just invisible in the plumbing. Like when you pull up a web page, there's an enormous number of things that happen behind the scenes. There's things like a DNS query, and there's routing, and there's all these things that you don't even have to think about because they're just deep in the plumbing, and they're so inexpensive and so reliable that you don't think about them. I think 20 years is a good time frame for a world where payments are like that. And I don't know exactly how that's going to change the world. I can't pretend that I can predict it. But I think particularly for people who've had difficulty accessing the financial system and for people who found that the payments world doesn't meet their needs, I think they'll be in for quite a significant improvement and more full participation in the global economy.
And Ripple will help build that thing, I assume.
I certainly hope we make some significant contributions.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, the audience, and we'll see you later.
Thank you.